thank you, and thank you very much for having me. Um, I'm a little hoarse today. I've been since Thursday. I've been gargling with Lysol and then washing it down with Windex. Um, I suggest it for everyone. Nothing like a little disinfectant. I haven't gotten coronavirus either. So
We hope you're kidding.
Who said you hope I'm kidding? Well, I know whatever he says, I do. Please come on. Let me, as I say, thank you for having me today to discuss my book. I thought I'd do a couple of things today. I was going to talk about the process of writing. I was also going to talk about, I also intend to talk about what it is that drives one to write a book and things I've learned since I wrote the book. One of my favorite memoirs, and I probably can't even tell you I can't tell you the name of the author right this minute because it's been so long, but the first line of his book was, "I have a terrible memory." And it was such an honest way to start the memoir. I've talked to other authors since and before my book was published. And the very first thing you realize when you start to write something about your life, a memoir, is that your memory becomes a separate entity. It becomes it can be your enemy or it can be your friend, but you have to separate it from yourself, because most often what we do, and I think if you write a memoir, you really realize it, is that we conspire with memory to make things come out as we want and not necessarily how they happened. So what you write, or what I wrote, was my truth. Is some of it wrong? Is some of it not on the money? Probably so. Probably so. And I see my friends Susan and Karen, and is that Lynn? Have just joined us. I'm so glad you're with us. There's Lynn. Dear friends of ours. One of the things that I learned was, in writing the book and sitting down to do it, is that it requires an enormous amount of research. And I'm sorry she's not on the phone call, but my sister, Linda Todar, I think she'll join us soon, did enormous research for me. He traveled around the country and got records. She did a great deal that helped me organize the book and to get some, and when I read a bit from the book, I'll do some readings from the book. She found records from the 1930s that affected our family. My son, Jeffrey, who's also on the call, recorded the book, which I think it was extraordinary. Jeff had a great deal of drama background. He went to Interlochen Academy up in Michigan for acting, and it has a profound way of adopting the voices of the people who are in the book. And so if you want to get is it Brilliant? Is that the name of it, Jeff, the company that recorded it?
I don't remember.
Whatever it was, it was quite some time ago, but that's a wonderful way to listen to the book. And I have listened to it 2 or 3 times, and I'm very proud of what he did. So it's not a singular exercise. I had editors. I had one editor whom you may know about, Lisa Halliday, who wrote the book Asymmetry. I don't know if you've read that. It was published a year or 2 ago, and it's a roman à clef. She was the agent. She worked as a book agent. She was a Harvard graduate, a very talented writer, and became Philip Roth's agent. They had an affair, which is very barely cloaked in the book she wrote, but I recommend Asymmetry to you, and she helped me enormously. What finally happened was, when I got the book written, I looked for my first entry about the book. It was 2008 on my computer. I finished it in 2013, and that's when I sent it off to an agent that the wonderful writer Mimi Schwartz, Houstonian, turned me on to. And he sent it out to 4 different publishing houses, and they all rejected it, but came back with a very similar criticism. that it wasn't organized, like it was hard to follow. So after a little bit, I found an editor named Jamie Malinowski, who was superb in helping me restructure the book. And it's basically divided into two halves. The first half is about Alan's early life, my early life, family life. The second half deals with his disappearance and his murder. These are difficult subjects. And when people ask me today, what's your book about? Even today, I'm reluctant to say, well, it's about my brother's murder, because that, that to me, it's just very difficult, A, to talk about it still, and B, what's very difficult is that that's not something likely to get somebody's attention, especially during the pandemic. We have enough bad news every night on the TV around the time our current president comes on the camera. So finally, I rewrote it, and my editor said, you know what? I know a guy, an editor over at Scribner, who's going to like this book. And sure enough, I got a call that he was interested in buying it. Well, when you say Scribner to an English major, which I was, it summons up this wonderful history that company has. And the company, at one time in the 1920s and 30s, there was a very famous editor by the name of Maxwell Perkins. There's a great biography of Perkins by Scott Berg, spelled the same way. And Perkins drew out the life of this wonderful editor who was editing at one time T.S. Eliot, F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, John Dos Passos. I'm sure I'm leaving out others, but this very romantic period of American literature, captured beautifully in the book Midnight in Paris, the movie Midnight in Paris. It's Woody Allen's movie. It's incredible. So I was thrilled to hear this. And we went to, he asked me to meet him. I was in Houston at the time. And the editor asked me to meet him across the street from Scribner's building on 6th Avenue, and something called the Pig and Chips or something like that. And I sat down with him, and we talked a good long time, and I could tell he was going to buy it. A few days later, my agent called me and said, David, they've offered you an advance of X dollars. I can get you more money. I said, don't, just publish it. I did not want to scare him off. So I got I've been published a great deal in my life. I've been a trial lawyer. I've lived my life, as we call it, in the pits of the courtroom, in the well of the courtroom. And it's a life well worth living. I also have written a great deal. And people ask me everyone has a story to tell. The question is, do they have well, let me say this. Hemingway was once asked, what's the hardest part about writing? And his answer was starting. Everyone has a story, but I had, in addition, an enormous need to write. I've always needed to write, whether I'm writing a brief or whether I'm writing essays and articles. It's something that satisfies me very deep down. So what was the story I was going to tell? The story I would tell was one that I'd never talked about. And that was about the murder of my brother. I was preternaturally close to Alan. I remember one of the greatest compliments I ever felt we ever got came from Harriet Wise's mother. Harriet and Alan were married at the time of his death. And his mother, and this sticks with me, said she'd never seen two brothers as close as we were. And coming from the Lavage family, if you know them, that's high praise. So let me start by talking to you a minute about my earliest memory. And that was how I started. Well, I didn't start the book that way. It's kind of interesting. The editor said, you have to create since I was going to discuss the trial of Alan's murderer, he said, you've got to establish your bona fides. You've got to let people know you know what you're talking about. So the prologue to the book is really a discussion of my relationship with Racehorse Haynes. Houstonians may remember that name. Racehorse was in the process of becoming the most famous lawyer in America during the 70s when I first met him in the late 60s. He had a huge influence on my life. So I talk a bit about that. I talk a bit how he motivated me. I talk about one of the most interesting cases I'd ever been involved in. And it was the case of a woman who had killed her husband, dismembered him, took his remains in actually she dismembered him with a buzzsaw, with a, what kind of saw is that? A bandsaw. The band broke and she took a respite from sawing him up. Went and got another band, came back and finished the job. So I went to see Haynes. She hired me. I went to see Haynes, and I was really at a low point in my life. I had just come back 2 years earlier from working for Jimmy Carter, which did not work out well, and I talk about in the book. And I was seated at the Avalon drugstore, which is where I did a great deal of my writing. And while I was there, I got a call from an old client. My secretary then put him through to me at the diner. I called him back. Said she called me, and I called him back, and he asked me to help her. Well, it was all over the newspapers, and I mean, you can imagine. So she had been arrested out in California at her parents' ranch, and while she was there, she told him what had happened. She went out to try to kill herself. The police stopped her, and she came back to Houston. So I went over to Haynes's house. He lived at 5 Kirby Drive, and I drove up. I wanted to be Haynes. I wanted to be as famous as he was. I wanted to be as good as he was, and I wanted a house with a single-digit address also. We never got down there. We got to a 16, but that never satisfied me.
If you had a question to this.
What?
Last picture. It is terrible.
Jordan, I couldn't hear you, but I think I'll go on. Let me keep going. So I went to see him, and we were at his house around a kitchen table, round, small table. And Haynes said to me, I was asking for advice. How am I going to win this case? He said, you got to get lucky during jury selection, which in my book I explained I really didn't. It changed my career. But he said, people don't mind women killing their husbands, but they don't like them messing with their bodies. So with that was the kind of advice I got. I got other advice from him that this early in the morning I won't read to you, but it's in my book. This is from my book, and let me open this door a little bit and get some light. My earliest memory is of Alan and me jumping down on the bed that we shared in Kalamazoo, Michigan. Mom shouted from the living room, "Go to sleep or your father's coming there with a strap." We shouted back that we would, but we didn't, and Dad came rumbling down the hall like a bowling ball headed for the 10-pin. My brother and I scrambled under the cover, a prickly blue woolen blanket that would follow me halfway across America, with Alan on top of me as my shield. Then the door flung open, and there he was, as menacing as the professional wrestler Man Mountain Dean, pulling off his belt and doubling it over, snapping its sides, and heading for our bed. When he got within range, he bent over and poked around until he found us. Then he hollered about putting a stop to all this horsing around and began slapping down his belt. I can hear the whap, whap even now. Finally, I caught on. The belt landed only where we weren't. Alan, already playing along, wailed loudly for Dad to stop, which he did. Then he plucked us up out of our hiding place, lowered us one by one onto our pillows, tucked the blanket around our shoulders, and kissed us goodnight. Slamming the door behind him, he bellowed down the hallway, "And I'll come straight back in here if I hear another peep out of either of you." My brother and I giggled ourselves to sleep that night. What satisfaction to be included in our father's elaborate deception, and what a habit it had become for our father to deceive. We had been in Kalamazoo for not too long a period of time when Dad met a woman named Dorothy Heinrich. That was 1946, the year our father met Dorothy Heinrich in a Kalamazoo diner. She would one day become his wife, but for now, she was his waitress. Dot was 5'10", with the sultriness of Rita Hayworth. Mom was 4'10", with the temperament of Henry VIII. So there you have it.
They have her in a terrible position now. Still looking up her nose, you know.
So I think I'm getting some reviews along the way here. That December, when I was 4 and Alan was 10, our parents separated and divvied us up. My brother to Dad and me to Mom. Mom was also pregnant with our sister Linda. So from that point on, during childhoods that rarely overlapped, my brother and I were raised as only sons. Over the years, Mom offered a litany of excuses for why she left her firstborn son with that, quote, mumser, Yiddish for bastard. I have to do that for non-Jewish audiences, but not my wife. And all things irredeemable. A boy needs his dad. Our father adored him. Alan had to finish the 5th grade. Each of those excuses for letting Alan go off with Dad was true, but none the truth. The truth was that Mom thought her little hellion would scare off 18-year-old Dorothy Heinrich. That was a serious miscalculation. The way Alan must have seen things, the way many children see these things, was that our mother gave up on him because he was responsible for her marriage falling apart. And when I think about what went wrong for my brother, as I often do, I keep returning to the irremediable damage that our parents' separation and all its repercussions had on the way he viewed himself and the world. Years went by, and let me get to the next point I want to get to. Years went by, and I never saw my father or my brother. I was 6 years old after my mom and dad separated. We went to Little Rock from Kalamazoo. I remember the train ride perfectly well. Sitting in the coach car, these really hard seats, Mom pregnant, and eating sandwiches she made. It was a great trip for me. And then we moved in with her mom and dad, my grandparents. I want to take a moment to talk to you about them. My grandmother, Hattie, Mama Hattie, we called her, was the safe harbor where I would go for all the miseries of a childhood, a skin knee, whatever it was. I think Mama Hattie probably introduced schmaltz to the Confederacy. Everything she made, it was blackened everything. And you'd have to do serious scraping to get whatever she cooked out of the skillet. I'd say, Mama Hattie, make me hamburger. And she'd say, I'll hamburger you, and then dip into the schmaltz and cook up a hamburger. We were Orthodox, but not in our food. So my grandfather was different. I got to talk to you about Daddy Joe for a minute. To call him, my sister and he got along great. I don't think he said 4 words to me my entire life until one day when I was at Tulane between my sophomore and junior years. I went back to Little Rock to see my family there. And I don't know why, we never talked to each other. He gave me a quarter once for mowing his yard and cutting the bushes. He was frugal. And I walked in their screened-in porch, which is part of my wife's and my culture. We love screened-in porches. We both grew up with them. And as I walked in, Daddy Joe was sitting. Anybody know what a Davenport is? These metal sliding sofas, if you will. And I walked by, and for some reason I said, Daddy Joe, I'm going to take my junior year abroad. And he stopped. He said, where are you going? I said, England. He said, sit down here, son. Well, that was the longest sentence he'd ever directed toward me. So I sat down, And he said, just shocked me to death. He said, you know, I got England started. We had Tommy Dorsey over there, had a pawn shop over in England. I had parties. Oh, we had a great time. Took me about 15 minutes to figure out that Daddy Joe was talking about England, Arkansas. He stood as, Daddy Joe stood as walking refutation that all Jews are smart. But he had something about him. So one other quick Daddy Joe story. Daddy Joe always had a smile on his face. That was not attributed so much to his good nature, but to the peppermint schnapps he drank in little slugs all day long. So finally, we go to Yom Kippur services. My mom and my sister and my grandma, no, not my sister, she was too young. My grandma and my mother are up in the balcony in this Orthodox setting. And Daddy Joe and my uncle Maurice, my mother's brother, and I are downstairs. And it goes on and on as Yom Kippur does. And we get to the final service of the day, the service of mourning. Daddy Joe is starving. He repairs himself to the car, leaves the synagogue, downs a 6-pack of Schlitz beer and a Hershey bar. To his credit, he almost made it back to his seat without passing out and puking in the aisle right there in the synagogue. So everyone is very concerned. And Mom and my grandma come running downstairs and they cordon off the area like it's a crime scene. And my grandma says, Joe's had a stroke. And Mom says, yes, Daddy's had a stroke, hasn't he? And people just walk all around him. So everybody's gone from the synagogue. They called an ambulance. Daddy Joe preferred to walk off his stroke rather than have it treated. So all the way home, Mama Hattie's driving this black car, probably a Packard or something, or a Ford, and screaming out the window, you Polish hunt, which roughly translated means, you dirty dog. Daddy Joe lived with couplets, and he turned to her and he said, hocus pocus, kiss my tokus. And that was exactly how I grew up. It was a wonderful time. We didn't have 2 cents to rub together, but I felt like I'd grown up in the most extraordinary circumstance, because when Mom and I were in Kalamazoo and Dad was not there for us, we did without food some meals. It was a very difficult time. So somehow my wife, oh, there she is. I thought you quit on me, Catherine. So I didn't see Alan until I was about 9 years old or 10 years old, and he was 16. Dad had married Dot. And on the day of their marriage, and this will sort of summarize their relationship between Dot and my brother, they had their wedding ceremony in Atlanta, Georgia. And Dot must have been 20 years old at that point. During the ceremony, Alan told me he couldn't stand to be there. He was the only person there, a couple of people from this company Dad worked for. And when it was over, Alan took a cup of water and threw it on Dot. You know, Alan was 15 or 16 at the time, and no, he was younger, actually, much younger. He was about 13 or 14, and you know how children are in divorces. And she hit him alongside his head with a Coke bottle. That's all I know about that story, but I do know that Dot hated Alan, and Alan hated Dot. And I like sentences like that in books because it tells you the truth, and it tells it as quickly as possible. So Alan went off and lived with them, and he had lived with Dad for 4 years, and they of course were very close. Alan, in a nutshell, could not do enough to satisfy my dad. Dad was very demanding, but they became close because when Dad would come home from work, in the apartments they lived in across the country, they lived in 4 or 5 cities. Dad would come home from work and he'd teach Alan how to play poker, and he would read books to him he thought young boys should read. And he was a good father to Alan. He was just a very difficult father, and just couldn't satisfy him. So Alan the marriage came along, and Alan was in Atlanta where they got married. And one day my father took all their money out of the bank, which was not very much. And he had worked in Beaumont for a while and met the Rogers brothers. Some of you may know them. And he and Saul became very good friends. But the Rogers brothers gave Dad $10,000 to open an upholstery business. That was a fortune. And so Dad drove from Atlanta with Dot and Alan in a car with wire around the door, so that if you had to get out, you had to undo the wire because the door was broken. But he came to Houston and immediately plunged into his business and did really well. So he started out on the west side of town, which is really a dump at that time, filled with, I was going to say shit kickers, but I will say it. It was a time when Houston began to boom. The oil business made a huge difference, and my father was selling upholstery and farming out the jobs, and he thought everybody who worked in Houston needed their furniture reupholstered. And he was pretty close to right. And soon he had a square block filled. He brought all the upholsterers he'd been farming out to work into his place, his plant. And it was very large, very profitable. And in 3 years, he bought out the Rogers brothers. And that's another story that I could tell you, but it takes too long. So he bought out the Rogers brothers. He was flying high. At the same time, my brother my mother and I were in Houston, in Little Rock, and I was really in trouble in school. My principal, Miss Hendricks, called Mom in, and she said, David, we're going to send David to a school next year, a special school, where he will get the kind of discipline he needs. And she described the school, and it sounded like a Hitler youth camp. So my mom, Miss Hendricks, I'll never forget this, told my mom, he needs a man's discipline, Millie. And my mom had been crying, and she's got really sober at that point and said, what he's saying, Miss Hendricks said, why doesn't he go live with his father? So my mother said, I'll never forget, said, he can't do that, Miss Hendricks. My ex-husband's wife is a harridan. You could tell by the look on Miss Hendricks' face, she had no idea what my mother was talking about. She didn't know what the word harridan meant, but it roughly translated from my mother, that meant that whore your father married, which I heard quite a bit.
Whore.
So I go to Little Rock, and the world changes. This woman I'd heard so much terrible stuff about turned out to be really nice to me. And they took me everywhere. There wasn't much cultural life in Houston, but the Alley Theater, and we'd go to the Alley together. They treated me splendidly. And now you really got to be old to remember this, but on Thursdays, we'd go to a place on Montrose, Luigi's, where the owner would sing arias from a little balcony within the restaurant. It was wonderful. So I had this great time, I did well in school. I'd been doing very badly. So I'm victimized by my own success, and I got to go back to Houston, to Little Rock. So I go back, and my sister will tell you it did not go well. So I go back to Woodruff Elementary, and I got in some trouble again because I shoved a teacher over a desk. They were very picky about the rules, and got kicked out. So after, I didn't get kicked out. My daughter's on here now, and I don't want her to think that I got kicked out of school, but they asked me to leave. So I go back to Houston, and within 2 months of getting there, my dad's business burns to the ground. When he bought out the Rogers brothers, it took every penny he had and then some, and he let his insurance drop. So he was ruined. I remember that night, the night of the fire, my dad sat across from lawyers, and his face was singed from the fire. His face was red and singed. And that was the time when Alan lived there too. And at the fire, I remember Dad my brother walked up and said, "I'm so sorry, Pop," and put his arm around him. And I was standing next to them. Dad put his arm around me, and we watched Dad's business, his livelihood, burn to the ground. For Dad, it was deja vu for his life to go badly. Let me see if I can find what I need here. Dad never spoke about this once, and it was verboten in our family to talk about it. You just didn't. But when Dad was 19, he was accepted to the University of Arkansas Medical School. Let me see if I can find that real quickly, because it gives you an idea of the anti-Semitic odds that people ran up against, even at Harvard and Yale. You know, by 1920, the number of Jews had doubled from 10% of classes at Harvard and Yale and the other Ivies. And so Yale created a personality test. And that would be an additional criterion, which was a way to keep Jews out of school. So my dad, this is where my dad and Mom met. My dad, this is my dad before he got into medical school. It was not simply about losing the plant. It also had to do with a terrible family secret, no less incendiary, and which I'd known about for as long as I could remember. My father's real dream had been to become a doctor, and he'd come very close. He'd been admitted to the University of Arkansas Medical School when he was only 19, and at a time of strict anti-Jewish quotas. Most likely, Dad got in because he was considered by the school that rarest of Jews, the honest Hebe. And the reason I say that, this is from the recommendation letter from his chemistry professor. Mr. Berg is to be preferred to many of the Jewish students that we've had. His college chemistry professor wrote to the admissions committee. He seemed to be honest and upright in his work. Anti-Semitism had played a big part in our lives, growing up in Little Rock and in Houston too, in the 60s. When I was 9, and I mentioned that Alan came to see us, I had an incident that cemented our relationship. I would go home from Woodruff Elementary every day. And when I got to 4th and Valmar Street, my grandparents lived on Valmar. There would be a guy there named Piggy Waldrop. And Piggy was a monster compared to me. He was a year older. I was about, I was a kid. I was like 9 years old, 10 years old. And he was about 5'7" already and weighed about 150 pounds, just eclipsed me. And every day as I tried to get to my grandparents' house, coming home from school, he would block my way. And I'd dart past him, he'd hit me in the back of my back, and he'd say, "The Jews killed Jesus." I didn't have time for a theological argument. I just wanted to get home. So my brother's in Little Rock, and I tell him about this guy. And one day how he'd hit me really hard. And my brother clenched his jaw. Alan had he looked like Tom Cruise, except without the good looks, just a very strong face. And when he clamped his jaws, you knew there was going to be trouble. The next afternoon, as we rounded Valmar and 4th, there was Piggy pacing the intersection, snarling as usual, daring me to cross. I tugged Alan's sleeve and pointed to the builder's lot that my friends and I called the woods. Covered by a canopy of leaves and branches that left the ground mysterious and damp, it had plenty of places to hide, which is what I suggested we do. My brother said nothing. He just kept walking. Emblematic of his life. When Alan got to him, Piggy did not attack. He had something else in his mind, something monumental that he had learned about the chosen people. Sneering down at us, he said, Daddy says Jews cut off their kids' dicks with a rusty knife when they turned 13. Alan reached up and poked his fingers into Piggy's face. Your daddy's an idiot. Are you calling my daddy a liar? No, I said he's an idiot. For a moment, Piggy looked amused. Then Alan hit him with a hard right hook that landed flush against his cheek. He followed up with a drop kick to the scrotal sac, and Piggy sank to his knees. That's when Alan climbed aboard him like he was the 319 and began pounding the back of Piggy's head, while my 175-pound nemesis cried for his mommy and condemned my brother as a dirty fighter. So by the time my mom got home from work, she had a radio show in Little Rock, the first woman to host a radio show in Arkansas. It was really good. Hey, honey, would you get some coffee or something? My wife just handed me a note. I didn't realize I'm at a half hour of the presentation. If you have any questions, you've got my email address. Just send it to me or to Justin, and he can forward it to me. So we were concerned. My mom, we were used to getting slapped by my mother, and she would dig her fingernails into your arms so that it would leave little half moons and until the hemoglobin came out from hiding and would fill it up. And she terrified me and my brother too. And we came in, and I remember she was wearing what she called her Russian mink, but it felt like horsehide. And she came in and she yelled, Alan Berg, you come in here and you tell me what happened. Well, Piggy's mom had already called her. They were friends. So it was just beautiful. Alan said, let me explain. And before mom started, mom also did something, it was a variation on, you put a knife through my chest. She would hold her arms upright and say, you're making my veins stick out. And there they'd be blue and throbbing, and you would feel guilty for doing this to her. So Alan told her the story. And she put her arms around him, and I remember she said, Ketzela, you did the right thing. Little kitten, you did the right thing. It was a shocking revelation. I translated Ketzela to mean, I'm glad you kicked his fat, bigoted ass. So that was where Alan and I cemented it wasn't the only thing, but we were very, very close. So I'm going to skip forward now and tell you that I didn't realize I was going on so long, but Alan came to live with us in Little Rock when he was 15. Dad and Dot had sent him first to a fundamentalist Christian military school in Bryan, Texas. And he had done very well there. Thank you so much. Thanks. He had done very well there. He won a declamation contest. He made A's and B's. But Alan, during his lifetime as a student, went to 13 schools in 12 years. And that kind of instability contributed to his way of looking at life. I don't know why. In fact, I got an email from another author who said, why would they do this to him? Why would they put a boy like that in those schools? They sent him off to Georgia Military Academy from Houston. So Alan, one night in the middle of a blizzard, put an end to his military career, and he showed up at our door wearing a pea coat and an olive drab snow cap, and he came to live with us. And I remember that night we sat around a table, Alan, Mom, and me. Now, if you were in the business of starting over, Alan owned that franchise, and the best backer you could ever have was my mother. She just thought her children could do no wrong. Alan got the full treatment, Greek God treatment that night. Mom used to read, I see my sisters on, she would read us the myths, Edith Hamilton's myths, and tell us you can do these things. You're just as good as any of the kids of those, quote, goddamn rich Jews. To her, anyone who drove a Buick was a rich Jew. So we had a wonderful time. Alan, there'd never been a man in our house. Daddy Joe was like a ghost. He wasn't there for us, but Alan was there. And I won't go into all the details, but that's when he heard about what Piggy had done to me. And that's how the fight ensued. Well, Alan was at Little Rock Central High the year before Little Rock Central was integrated. And he didn't stay there that year. He was a senior, and they were going to let him walk across the stage, but not get a diploma because there was some rule that forbade crap games on the campus. It was unfair to Alan. He just made a little extra money, and he also got in a lot of fights because everyone in our family were fervid integrationists in a time when it was dangerous to be integrationists. So Alan decided he would call Dad, see what he could do, and Dad told him, "I tell you what, you go to Beaumont." Dad had opened up a plant there, and he said, "You run that place, and if you do well in high school," he went to Beaumont High, "I will send you to college, but only to Texas A&M, and only if you agree to become a doctor." So Alan did graduate. He went off to A&M. He hated it and ended up in the Navy for 2 years. And we only saw him twice during that 2-year period. He came home once. I wish I had some way of finding this woman. He came home once with a girlfriend named Linda Fink from Boston. She was pregnant. And I watched through the door as my father screamed at them, "You're going to get an abortion. I don't care how nice you are. You're going to get an abortion. You get out of my house." And that's all I'll tell you about that. But it was terrible. The next time Alan came home, he came home with another woman, 1958, who was black. I had never been in a room with an African-American woman who wasn't cleaning it. Now here we are. This was no, what was the name of that movie? Dinner with, whatever it was. It was not as easy as it should have been. I would leave the room concerned the Klan was going to be there riding on their horses because people got killed for being around black people back then. This is in Houston. So Alan left, and I won't tell you what happened that night, but I will tell you that Alan saved my life. I'll let you can buy the book, buy the hardback. I've had to pay the tuition myself for Caitlin. Don't do the Kindle thing. It's too cheap if you people don't do that. So Alan goes off to the Navy, and when he does return, he was really angry at me for how nervous I was when he had that wonderful woman in the house. And he came home, and I didn't expect to see him. And there he was in our den, bathed in sunlight from this big plate glass window, wearing blue jeans, white shirt, and sunglasses like Buddy Holly's. And that day, he and I, which I go into at length, that day he and I talked a great deal about the things we loved, about poetry. I opened his duffel bag for him, and all kinds of books fell out. I saw that he was reading Dylan Thomas, the poet. I said, "I don't understand his great work." Dylan Thomas's great work was Fern Hill. He explained it to me. And before you know it, Alan, who had gotten out of the Navy with a few bucks in his pocket, had taken me down to Sakowitz Brothers and bought me enough clothing to clothe an army of orphans. Alan returned with resolve. He went to the University of Houston. He worked very hard. He had failed. What is the course you got to take to get into medical school? Not quantitative analysis. What is it? Oh, some incredibly hard course. And he went back, he raised it to a B, And he applied to 8 medical schools and was turned down by 7. But we had heard that the guy who interviewed him, the doctor who interviewed him at UT, really liked him down in Galveston. And one day I was off at Tulane, and I got a call from my brother, and he was crying and saying, "Did you hear? Did you hear? I got into medical school." And my dad was on the phone. I'd never heard him that happy, literally. And I said, "Have you told Mom yet?" And he said, "We just called her." And I said, what was her reaction? He said, "She's probably still quelling." So Alan got prepared to go off to school and medical school. And I will tell you this part of the story. This has to do with my father's temper. And Alan, it was one of those really hot Houston days when you can hear the cicadas, and the heat was unbearable. And I was in the other room at the other side of the house on Durness Way. And thank you. Oh yeah, okay, I will. I was on the other side of the house on Durness Way, and I heard screaming in our driveway. And my brother had come to the house to pick up a television set to take with him to Galveston. And my father was saying, "You're not smart enough to watch TV and get through medical school," and just horrible stuff. And when I came out, Alan had the TV set in his arms, and he picked the TV set up over his head. And I looked at his eyes. He wasn't angry. He wasn't crying. He was empty. He was disbelieving. He threw the TV set down at my father's feet. I wish it had exploded and cathode rays had gone everywhere. I came out and grabbed my dad and said, "You got to stop, leave him alone." And Alan got in the car and took off. I didn't talk to Dad that weekend, but Monday I had to because Alan never showed up for medical school. So I didn't know where my brother was, and Dad and I knew better than, we went to Galveston. There's no point. We knew he just didn't enroll. And a few days later, I got a call, and it was Alan. And he said, "I just wired you $250. I'm in Las Vegas. I just won $2,500, which was a fortune then. And I'm going to stay here and be a gambler. You want to come live with me?" Well, I told my father the choice that he made, and my father said, "You can do what you want, but if you walk out this door, don't ever come back." Well, I was thrilled with that option because Dot, living in a house with my stepmother, who had this ice pick anger in her voice, was just, had gotten to me. And by the way, if I had something to add to this book, now all these years later, it would be a profound apology to my father and to Dot, because I was a handful. I was awful. So I said, "That's great." And I go to Western Union, get the money. And at 5, the only thing that could have stopped me from going was my brother. And the next morning he called me and said he'd lost it all back and please send the $250. I stayed in Houston. So years go by and Dad and Alan go into business together. It's a rough road to get there, but I'll leave it to you to read the book. And they open up a carpet business, and it was a boiler room operation. What that was that people would sit at a phone, maybe 30 women would sit at a phone, all women, and they'd call into the most gullible and the poorest neighborhoods in Houston, the wards. And they would up leads, they were called, or appointments, where Dad and Alan would go out and sell carpet. Well, when Dad went into business with Alan, he took over the business side. Alan was an astonishing salesman. It's where I learned how to close. I didn't need to go to law school after I watched him close a carpet deal. He would set it up ahead of time in a way that sounded something like out of the movie and Glengarry Glen Ross, which I recommend all of you see. But I learned how to listen to people, listen to what bothered them, and overcome those objections, which is what a jury trial is all about. It's about a lot more, but that's really at the heart of it. So Alan would call up and you'd hear him say, "Well, Mr. Jordan," he said, "May I call you Vernon? Because I got a feeling we're going to be friends, Vernon." And I hope that before I come out there to show you carpet, will you promise me this? Will you promise me that you'll sit down and have a cup of coffee, you and your wife? What's her name again? Alice. Alice, I think you and Alice and I are going to become good friends. And before you knew it, Alan would have him sold on, if I find the carpet you like, if you see the carpet you like, and I can arrange payments that you can make, easy payments, would you buy that carpet, sir? And before he got off the phone, he had the carpet sold. He was astonishing. So that went on for a while, and they opened up a San Antonio plant, and this was fateful. By then, Alan was married to Harriet Labbage. And I don't know if any of you know her, Harriet Wise, but she's an extraordinary human being. Alan had been married 3 times by then and divorced. And if you believe the story about Mexico, which I do, it'd be 4 times. As I look back, it was his desire, his strong desire, to build a family that really worked. And he did it with Harriet. And but he didn't like driving to San Antonio twice a week, so he quickly hired a guy to run the place. My dad was upset because he didn't, Alan never took the time to check the guy's credentials out, but he had been in the carpet business, or in siding sale. He was a siding salesman from Kansas City. He was also, Alan didn't know, connected to the mafia. And for a while, things went great. And then Alan and Dad started getting calls saying that he was selling like crazy. But some employees called and said they were getting calls from customers saying, "Where's my furniture?" And what had happened was, as Dad later found out, and he was pocketing down payments, and he wasn't delivering the goods. He was just stealing the money. So, and Dad and Alan had set him up with, when he had done so well, they had set him up with an override on his sales. They'd given him his own bank account, and that's how the money got into his pocket if the down payment was paid by a check, with a check. So Dad drove to San Antonio. They told him to meet him at the office, and they called the police, and he never showed up, and the police didn't either. So within weeks, Dad and Alan and I were astonished to see that that man had come to Houston to set up his own carpet business, which he did. His name is Frank DeMaria. You may have seen Maria Carpet, DeMaria Carpeting. And he wanted to go into business, and my father became obsessed with killing any kind of financing he could have had. And he would tell everybody who'd listened to him the story of how badly this man treated him. Then the red flags began to show themselves. Linda was in the bedroom. Linda had come down. She was living with Mom in New York. And because they had to move, my mother and her husband had to move, she came to live with us her senior year of high school. Or she was visiting, but she was there. And she was terrified one night when she was in her bedroom, and she looked out the window, and there was some guy who was staring at her, and she screamed, and the guy ran away, and she described him to my dad, and he said, "That's Frank." Then I got a call one night when I was at Dad's house, and it was Frank, and he said, "I hear you're the lawyer." And I said, "Yeah, what do you want?" He said, "That painting your dad has in the living room, how much do you think that's worth?" He said, "Because I'm going to own it." And Dad grabbed the phone and screamed at the guy, and nobody could lob a goddamn like my father, and said, "You leave my family alone." Hung up. And then the most serious red flag of all. Alan, excuse me, Alan came home one night down North Braeswood in a storm, and a car ran him off the road. And Alan went sliding down into the bayou, and he had a big car, and it came to a stop at some point, and saved his life just by, I don't know how he did it. And he said it was Frank's car. So Dad and I sat down with Alan, and it's a moment, another moment pivotal in Alan's life, akin to that moment in the driveway. And we sat down with Dad, and we got all the employees out of the kitchen at their place of business. And we said, Dad, you got to stop. You got to quit. You got to leave this guy alone. He's dangerous. And I said, yeah, I'm afraid he's going to hurt somebody. And Dad said, what do you know? You're just a kid. I said, I may be a kid, but I'm scared for you and Alan. And Alan tried to talk. And when I said that, it came at the last, I said I was scared. And Dad got up and ran out of the room and said, yelling that he would take care of it. And pretty soon we, as our conversations often did, we were yelling at each other. Yeah, all three of us were yelling, none of us knowing what to do or say to stop this. And I just opened my law office. Remember, that was a day in May 1st, 1968. And Alan came down and he told me he was getting out of the carpet business, that he couldn't stand working with Dad. They fought every day. And it was just the dynamic of our family was too much argument. And I don't know if anybody grows up in households like that. Not many people do, but everything seemed to be conflict, except with Alan and me. And that day he came down to my office and he brought me a box of opening gifts from my office, including one of those erasers with a duck on the top of it, and a lunchbox with Roy Rogers and Trigger on it. And he sat there all day and he told me that he was deeply in debt to a bookie, but he told me he was going to quit work and become a lawyer. He wasn't going to stay in that business. And to this day, my reaction was not what it should have been. I was not happy to hear that, because I was afraid that Alan, with all his cockamamie schemes, would get us disbarred, because we worked together. There'd be no way around it. But I said, that's great. We walked downstairs to his car. He had a green Cadillac and he had a driver. This was not a tribute, as I recently explained to my daughter, to his skills as a driver or his wealth by any means. It was a tribute to the fact that he got his driver's license suspended. He had $15,000 worth of parking and speeding tickets. So he was standing there on the curb with his sunglasses on. And he said, I'm so proud of you, kid. He'd always call me kid. I'm so proud of you. You became a lawyer. I said, I could not do this without you, Alan, because he was the one always putting cash in my pocket. And when he came home from his honeymoon with Harriet, guess who was there to live with them? The Schnorrer brother-in-law. I lived with them the first year of their marriage. So he looked at me. He was so proud that I'd become a lawyer. He hugged me and he said, I love you, kid. And I said, I love you too, Alan. And that was the last time I ever saw him alive. Alan, a month later, Alan disappeared. And I don't have a lot of time, but it's detailed in the book. So I'll take 10 more minutes and then we'll move on. And I'll see if anybody has any questions. And rather than email me, you can just ask them from the audience. It's fine. Am I running over time here? Is there a time limit of some sort, Justin, or no? Is it okay? I can't hear you.
You're good.
Okay.
I think I have an 8-hour block. No, I'm just kidding.
Yeah, I don't want to take everybody away from their busy schedules. Catherine and I have the Epstein bar mitzvah next July, a year from July. So I'll get finished before then. So one morning at 4 a.m., I got a call from Harriet telling me Alan hadn't come home. I knew the instant I heard that Alan was gone. That didn't change things. For the next 6 months, we hardly anybody in our family took an unlabored breath. When I read about parents whose children have disappeared, like that poor Holloway woman in Atlanta, whose daughter was killed in Aruba, it just breaks my heart because I've been through it. I know what it does to people. The case was finally broken. My dad, because the police wouldn't launch an investigation, my dad did it on his own. And he and Dot uncomplainingly spent every penny they had, literally every penny, to try to find Alan. They put up a reward. They hired investigators. Nothing would happen. And finally, Dad hired an investigator named Claude Harrelson. And magically, within a day, Claude said he wanted to meet Dad. And he met him at the Avalon, and Dad took a lawyer with him who used to be a member of Emmanuel. And Claude told him, I know what happened to your son. He said, if you repeat this, I'll be murdered. And then he said, what happened to my baby? And he said, your son is dead. He was murdered. And for $3,000, I can find out where his body is. And Dad told me how he was at a table and he had to hold on to it because everything began to spin. Here is his child. He and Alan fought like crazy, but you couldn't find two people who loved each other more. Alan spent his life with Dad in his head. He lived his life according to what Dad wanted him to do. A lot of us do things like that, sometimes for good and sometimes for ill. And Dad said, finally, okay, he asked his lawyer. He said, I'll do it. He said, that was late of a Friday afternoon. He said, I'll get the money Monday morning. And Claude Harrelson said, expect a call this evening. So my then wife, Dale, and I went over to the house. And we sat there with Dad and Dot waiting on the call, and it didn't come. And finally at midnight, my father broke down. He'd been through a hell of a lot. People calling up, hitting him up for money, lying to him, telling him. One guy who hated my father called up and said, your son was put through a meat grinder. And Linda was there and said, my father turned and threw up in a wastebasket. So on it went. It was terrible, but this guy had real information. And Dad broke down and cried at midnight waiting on that call and said, I just want my boy back. I just want him back. And he began to cry, and I walked with him into the bedroom. And I sat down beside him, and I said, and I put my arm around him and consoled him. And suddenly, for some reason, we started laughing. And maybe it was because of a reference I made to Pogo. He and I loved Pogo, the old political strip, a cartoon strip. And he said, you know, I love you, son. I said, I was already through with law school, and I said, is it too late for me to become a doctor? And we both laughed. At 3 a.m, we had left. He got a call from a very muffled voice demanding $6,000. And then Dad said, I really can't get it today. It's Saturday, but I'll get it to you Monday. Monday, he gets a call at 6 a.m. and 6,000 becomes 10,000. And Dad calls up Claude Harrelson and says, I'm not doing this. This is nonsense. And I'm on the phone on the other line. And Harrelson said, I'm not going to go with you to the police. I won't do it. And Dad hurtled. I mean, Dad could throw some F-bombs, as they call it, with the best of them. But he really laid into Harrelson. I felt great for him, and he felt great for me. So we went to the police, and they still wouldn't open an investigation. And finally, we hired an investigator who said, you got to go to the press. And this was a turning point in my life. One Sunday morning, a Saturday rather, to multiple calls and some terrible twists and turns, and the efforts of George H.W. Bush, who really helped our family. He got the FBI involved. This was a local matter, but the FBI got involved because of an investigation they were doing of gamblers whom Alan knew and had associated with. Of a Saturday, we paid a reward. Dad paid a reward, their last penny, $10,000. life savings gone. And it didn't matter to him or to Doc, who was very frugal, but just understood. And Dad had the comfort of Dot. I had the comfort of my then wife, Dale. They were rocks during that time. Finally, they found Alan's remains down in Seabrook, near Seabrook, between Seabrook and Galveston, toward Galveston more or less. They found his remains in a ditch where his body had been thrown. Is that it? Okay. Oh my gosh. My wife just handed me a note that very nicely says to shut up and ask for questions. I will just tell you this. What followed through a long period of investigation was the arrest of a man. We had gone 6 months without knowing what happened to Alan. I knew from the start, but you hope and you hope that he's alive. So we through a series of events, it turns out that the murderer was a man named Charles Harrelson, who was Woody Harrelson's father. He was a serial murderer. The book deals with his trial. I go into detail. I critique the trial and the way it was handled, botched. The man was acquitted. He later was convicted of another murder, and then he killed a federal judge in prison in San Antonio, John Wood, Hanging John, they called him. He was tried, convicted, and sent to the penitentiary for 2 life terms. He almost got a new trial. Now, I can't say that he got a fair trial in San Antonio, Harrelson. Just as a lawyer, the judge who presided over the case had been a pallbearer at the judge's funeral, and the courthouse was named the John W. Woods Courthouse. So he didn't get a fair trial. But his son, Woody, started intervening at that point and began to lionize his father publicly. I deal with that in the book. A famous producer who I was at a party with, told me that if Robert Duvall and Woody Harrelson were not movie stars, they'd be in jail. Maybe not like father, like son. And I know that was his father. But when I read in the New York Times how much he wished he could just be on a beach somewhere having lunch with his father, I thought, you don't know how much I'd like to be on a beach with my brother. The last thing I will tell you was that I could never bring myself to go to my brother's grave at Beth Yeshurun. That was Harriet's synagogue. And one time, my niece, Alan's third child, Allison Goldberg, and I went out there because she wanted to know more about her dad. And we went out there, and I still don't know who did it, but there's a beautiful horseshoe hedge around Alan's grave. And they buried him on the outskirts of the synagogue. I didn't understand why they did that at the time, but I do now. That's where you put people who bring shame to families, criminals or suicides or people who've been murdered. And I haven't stepped foot inside but one synagogue since. Finally, I will tell you that the book ends with my visit to the cemetery by myself. And the best part of my life was climbing over there's a broken fence. And to get in there, I was 68 at the time. I committed 2 misdemeanors, trespassing, destruction of property, and 1 felony.
You can have
and finally, I spent a day at Alan's gravesite. I had a bottle of whiskey with me, and I just talked to him, and it was wonderful because I had not called his name in so many years. And that's it. And my wife says it's time for me to ask if anybody has any questions.
David, I have a question here. Yeah, from Catherine Weil. And she wants to know, what techniques did Percy Foreman use that helped get Harrelson acquitted? Did you learn anything from Foreman's performance that you have incorporated into your trial techniques?
Well, let me start by saying that Percy Foreman, I've learned nothing from Percy Foreman. What I learned from Racehorse. Percy Foreman had a winning record beyond belief. And the reason he had a winning record beyond belief is because he had a coterie of, excuse me, what he called his reserve witnesses. Joe Jamail told me he was getting ready to go to trial in a personal injury case. And Foreman, he was friends with Foreman, he had represented him. And Foreman came up and said, "You need some witnesses? I got them for you." So two things. One, he suborned perjury. He always had alibi witnesses, and he had it in this trial. You'll find out about that in the book. Foreman was the most famous criminal lawyer in America at the time, but those of us in the law knew he was a crook. He had been indicted several times himself. One time, Racehorse told me he went to a grand jury to admit that he told a woman he was representing, "Get me $10,000 for juror number 6 or whatever it would have been, and I'll get you out of this." And he went to the grand jury and he told him he did do that, but he backed out at the last minute and didn't get the money and walked away from it. In those days, if you backed out of a conspiracy, you couldn't be held liable. So I didn't learn a damn thing from him. I did learn one thing. There was one, he was tried, Harrelson was tried down in Angleton in 1970. That was not a hotbed of liberal thinking. It was an all-male jury. I bet they'd never met a Jew in their life. And Foreman did put Allen on trial. He started by saying there were 22 people with reason to kill Allen Berg. Well, there was one piece of evidence that was particularly, and I will add to that also. When he finished the opening statement, one would have expected the prosecutor, a guy named Ogden Bass, who was just dumber than a sack of lug nuts. I mean, unbelievable. He became a judge later. But Foreman did this vicious opening statement. You'd expect Bass to get up and say, "Listen, Allen had his faults, but he didn't have 22 enemies. He was a patriot. He was a Navy man." Just things that, he got honorable discharge from the Navy. And instead, Bass didn't do an opening statement. Well, throughout the trial, there was one piece of evidence that my sister Linda especially was excited for the jury to see. And it was this beautiful picture of Allen, Harriet, and their children. They had 2 children at that point. And Linda was in the galley watching the trial. And she saw Foreman pick up the picture and put it in his pocket so that it would never go to the jury. They put stacked all the evidence on a table. And at a break, Linda rushed up to the prosecutor. There were 2 of them, Buster Brown, who became a state senator, and Ogden Bass, who thought he'd become governor based on this trial when he whipped Percy Foreman. That's what he told Racehorse Haynes. And Linda walked up to the prosecutor and told him what happened. And the prosecutor said, "Well, I didn't see it," and dismissed it. Then Buster Brown's wife came up and told him she saw it. Brown told me something. I've never understood his reaction, but he told me, laughing about it, that night, Foreman invited him for a drink at his hotel room. Because Brown said, my wife saw you put that in your pocket. So he goes and has a drink with Brown, and he starts laughing and tells Brown, "I must be losing my grip a bit. I'm getting older. You saw me put that picture in my pocket, didn't you?" And Brown did nothing about it. They had a hearing about it, and Foreman was righteously indignant about it. And the judge did nothing. The judge was a buddy of his too. So that was the way the trial went. So what did I learn from Percy Foreman? Nothing. Years later, I won a case, and a big murder case. And he was in the same building I was in on the corner of Rusk and Main. And we were standing there. He was 6'5", just towered above me. And he said, "That was a remarkable verdict you got." And I looked at him, I said, "Yeah." And I did it without suborning perjury. Then I walked away. I've gotten some flack from people who really loved Percy Foreman because they thought that I had been unfair to him. I wasn't unfair. But go ahead. Any other questions? Or does anybody else have a question? Here's one. Did you always want to be a lawyer, or were you just going to depend on your movie star good looks and go to Hollywood? I'm not going to answer that. That's really it. It's an inappropriate kind. I mean, yes, I admit to the movie star good looks, but there you have it. I've kept you wonderful people too long, and if nobody has a question, I'll thank you again. Oh, someone's typing on her cell phone.
Oh.
No, Jerry, if you're sending me a question, it's fine. No, well, she was saying, will this guy ever shut up?
Linda wrote in the chat here, did you tell them that Alan never saw his third child?
Who wrote that?
I think Linda Todar, I think your sister. Yeah, Linda. I think it's Linda. Yeah, it is Linda. Yeah.
No, there's lots I didn't tell. I don't have time. Well, several of you appear to be comatose. I'm really sorry. I've gone on forever. So feel free if you've got a question. If not, we'll just call an end to this and thank you. Oh, I want to tell you something. Starting today, I don't know how to listen to a podcast, but I'm going to find out. Starting today, there's a podcast that will be run in May called Son of a Hitman. And it's about Charles Harrelson and Woody Harrelson. And I may have the name wrong, but you can chop around, Google it and find out. Starting today, they are teasing it. I'm in the podcast. I was interviewed at length, as was my sister. And I was told to listen today for the teaser. And if you get interested in this, the Rangers told us that Harrelson killed at least a dozen men and maybe as many as 20 back in the 60s and through the 70s. If you're interested in those kinds of podcasts, I know the people who did it they're very good at what they're doing. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, David, for presenting to us, and we appreciate it. So.
Oh, it was my pleasure. My pleasure. I've got another 3 hours free if you.
Just so y'all know, I started talking to David probably 3 years ago.
Yes.
To make something happen. So, but no, really appreciate you coming, and thanks for all the participants for attending as well. We appreciate it.
Very good.
Thanks to you, everybody.
You enjoyed your story.
Pardon me?
Enjoyed your story.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Good day, everybody. Stay well.
Thank you. You too.